It is the morning of November 24th, 1740. You are standing in a field outside London. Around you, somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people have gathered. They brought food. Some brought their children. A few climbed trees for a better view. There's a man selling oranges nearby, doing excellent business. Nobody looks particularly troubled. In 20 minutes, a 17-year-old boy is going to be hanged by his neck until dead in front of all of them. And when it's over, everybody is going to go home. That's Tuesday in Georgian England. The boy's name is William Duell, and here is where his story gets strange. Because William Duell isn't going to die today. He's going to try. The state is going to try. The rope is going to do its absolute best. But in approximately 4 hours, William Duell is going to open his eyes on a dissection table, sit up, and ruin everyone's afternoon. And then the British government is going to have a problem they have absolutely no legal framework to solve. Let's back up. William Duell was 17 years old and, by most accounts, not especially remarkable. In October 1740, he and 4 other men attacked a young woman named Sarah Griffin on the road outside London. She died. This was, to put it plainly, not good. All 5 men were arrested. All 5 were tried. All 5 were convicted. In Georgian England, this process took approximately 3 weeks from crime to death sentence. The legal system was not what you would call slow. The date was set. Tyburn, London's public execution ground, located more or less where Marble Arch stands today, was booked. Notices were posted around the city. Vendors began planning their routes. Now here is something worth understanding about public execution in 18th century England, because it's easy to look at it from the outside and assume everyone involved was grim and reluctant and deeply troubled by the whole affair. They weren't. Tyburn could draw crowds of 50,000 people on a big day. Wealthy families paid for window seats in the buildings overlooking the gallows. Vendors sold hot food, beer, pamphlets, portraits of the condemned. Poets wrote ballads about the men and women being hanged while the rope was still being measured. There was a pub called the Bowl nearby that did extraordinary business on execution mornings. Execution was civic entertainment, a warning, a performance. The state wasn't hiding what it was doing. The state was enormously proud of what it was doing. William Duell was going to die in front of 50,000 witnesses, and every single one of them was going to agree that justice had been served. Except it wasn't quite going to go that way. November 24th, Tyburn. William Duell is loaded onto an open cart with 4 other condemned men. They are driven through the streets of London in what was called the hanging procession, a slow public route from Newgate Prison to the gallows. The crowds line the streets the entire way. Some people throw things, some people cheer, some people just stare. The cart pulls beneath the Tyburn gallows, a 3-legged wooden frame large enough to hang multiple people at once, nicknamed the Triple Tree. The nooses go on. The cart moves forward. The men drop. And here is the part that modern audiences often don't fully grasp, because we tend to imagine hangings as quick. They weren't. Not in 1740. There was no trapdoor, no carefully calculated drop designed to break the neck cleanly. Georgian hanging was strangulation. The condemned were simply lifted off the cart and left to suffocate while the crowd watched. It took anywhere from 2 minutes to half an hour, depending on the individual. The crowd sometimes pulled on the legs of those dying, trying to speed things up. This was not considered cruel. This was considered merciful. Family members sometimes paid men to do it. After roughly 20 minutes, William Duell stopped moving. A guard checked for a pulse. Nothing. No breathing. Sentence carried out. Justice served. The crowd began to disperse. William Duell was cut down, loaded into a cart, and transported across the city to Surgeons' Hall on Old Bailey. Here's something the history books don't always explain clearly. In 1752, Parliament would pass the Murder Act, formally authorizing the dissection of executed murderers and handing their bodies over to surgeons for anatomy. The law came about partly because body snatching had become an enormous problem. Medical schools needed cadavers. Freshly executed criminals were the best available supply. There was an entire shadow economy operating out of Tyburn, and Parliament eventually decided to just make it official. But that was 1752. William Duell died in 1740. In 1740, the arrangement was informal. Certain condemned criminals were designated, more or less quietly, for post-execution dissection. The surgeons were waiting. The Crown looked the other way. William Duell's body arrived at Surgeons' Hall in the early afternoon. He was stripped, laid on a table. The instruments were arranged. And then one of the assistants noticed something. The chest, moving, very slightly, almost imperceptibly, but moving. They leaned in. William Duell was breathing. Not confidently, not well, but breathing. The surgeons did what you would expect trained men of science to do upon discovering that their cadaver was not, in fact, a cadaver. They panicked. A surgeon named Frank Nichols, who would later write up the entire incident for the Royal Society, immediately ordered that no one touch the body. No dissection, no instruments, no further examination. Just wait and watch. Over the next several hours, William Duell's condition slowly improved. He was moved to a chair, given water, kept warm, spoken to, though he couldn't initially respond. By early evening, he was sitting upright. By nightfall, he was speaking. He had no memory of the execution, no memory of the cart, no memory of the table. The last thing he could recall, vaguely, was being in the cart on the way to Tyburn. After that, nothing. He was, by every observable measure, alive. The surgeons sent word to the authorities, and now the British government had a problem. Let's think through this carefully, because it's actually a fascinating legal puzzle. William Duell had been sentenced to death. The sentence had been carried out. He had been hanged at Tyburn before 50,000 witnesses. He had been pronounced dead by a guard. He had been transported, processed, and laid on a dissection table. By every legal standard available in 1740, William Duell was dead. But William Duell was in a chair, drinking water, alive. Could you hang him again? Genuinely unclear. There was no law that said you could. There was no law that said you couldn't. English common law had simply never considered the scenario. The assumption was that the rope worked. Some argued that justice demanded a second attempt. The sentence was death. The death had not occurred, technically. A mechanical failure shouldn't constitute a pardon. Others argued, and this was not a fringe position, that surviving an execution was an act of God. That if divine providence had seen fit to return this man to the living, mortal courts had no authority to reverse the decision. This wasn't superstition. It was an entirely serious theological and legal argument. And it had precedent. 90 years earlier, in Oxford, a young woman named Anne Green had been hanged for infanticide, accused of killing a baby many historians now believe was stillborn. She was cut down, coffined, and delivered to a physician for anatomy. When the coffin was opened, she groaned. She had survived. The court pardoned her immediately. The judge ruled that providence had clearly intervened, and it was not the place of men to overrule a divine verdict. Anne Green was released. She went on to marry, have 3 children, and live another 15 years. She kept the coffin in her living room, showed it to visitors. William Duell's case was raising the exact same question. The sentence was death. The man was alive. What does the law do? The answer, as it turned out, was not hang him again, but also not release him. The authorities made a pragmatic decision. A second hanging was too complicated, Too much public scrutiny, too much theological liability, too many people who had watched the first one and would have opinions about a second. The legal framework for re-execution didn't exist, and creating it would take longer than anyone wanted to deal with. But William Duell had still participated in a violent crime. A woman was still dead. Simply releasing him wasn't an option either. The solution was transportation. William Duell was sentenced to transportation, effectively indentured labor in the American colonies. No second execution, no freedom. A legal middle ground that allowed the system to declare itself satisfied without having to answer the hard questions. He was shipped across the Atlantic, and there the historical record ends. What became of him in the colonies is unknown. Whether he served out his time or didn't, survived the crossing or didn't, built a life somewhere in the New World or didn't, history stops caring about William Duell the moment he leaves British soil. He is a problem that was solved by being put on a boat. Here's what I keep coming back to. William Duell survived his hanging because Georgian executions were imprecise. There was no science to it. You were strangled until you stopped moving and someone pressed a finger to your neck for a few seconds. Sometimes they checked correctly, sometimes they didn't. The same was true for Anne Green. For at least a dozen other documented survival cases across 17th and 18th century England. These weren't miracles. They were quality control failures. They were equipment malfunctions. But the courts didn't treat them as malfunctions. The courts treated them as messages, as theological events, as evidence that the universe had weighed the condemned and returned a verdict. Which means that the British legal system, one of the most sophisticated legal systems on Earth at the time, was formally outsourcing its quality control to the Almighty. And the Almighty had an inconsistent track record. The people who survived weren't necessarily innocent. William Duell participated in the death of a young woman. Anne Green's baby was still dead, whoever's fault it was. Surviving the rope didn't make you a good person. It made you physiologically unusual. It made you lucky. But the law couldn't accept that. The law needed meaning. It needed the sentence to mean something beyond, "We hanged you and you stopped moving." So when the universe declined to cooperate, the law reached for theology instead of acknowledging that the mechanism was broken. The Murder Act of 1752 didn't directly address the survival problem. Parliament wasn't thinking about William Duell when they passed it. They were thinking about body snatchers and the chronic shortage of anatomy cadavers. But the act changed things anyway. It formalized the post-execution dissection process, created witnesses, created records, made the whole procedure more deliberate, which, incidentally, made accidental survivals harder to quietly manage. And by the early 19th century, when documented cases of the recently executed, still occasionally showing signs of life on the dissection table, continued to surface, the institutional response had quietly shifted. No more theological deliberation. No more waiting for a divine verdict. The answer was, make sure. The law had decided it didn't want any more William Duells, not because it had solved the theological question, but because it had decided the theological question was inconvenient and the mechanical one was solvable. Which is a very human solution to a very human problem. Stop asking what it means, just fix the machine. William Duell spent 3 weeks on death row, 20 minutes at the end of a rope, and several hours on a surgeon's table. Then he was put on a boat and forgotten. Anne Green kept her coffin in the sitting room. The law eventually closed the loophole. Modern executions are witnessed, verified, documented. The protocols exist specifically because of cases like this. Because the 18th century learned, the hard way, that reliably killing a person is harder than it sounds, and that the alternative is paperwork nobody wants to write. Whether that's progress is a question I'll leave to you.
But the truth is, we just don't know.